All right. Good morning and welcome. Today we're looking at Daniel chapter 9. We're very slowly working our way through the book of Daniel. And today we have Daniel 9, which deals with the penitent prayer of Daniel, followed by 4 verses involving the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And so we'll try to untangle all of this and to make sense of why Daniel is actually praying this prayer, why it's followed up by Gabriel visiting and offering this vision of 70 weeks, and also answering the question, what is the relationship between those two events? Like, what is the relationship between the vision of the 70 weeks and the prayer that Daniel actually offers? And that's usually a question that gets overlooked. So I'll do the best we can, and uh, let's just get started. So I'll share my screen. All right. I imagine everything should look good right now. Um, okay, so I thought I'd give the title to this teaching, the 70 weeks. I will acknowledge that in some sense I have to kind of apologize because towards the end of this, I would say within the last 4 verses, it's going to become somewhat technical, and I'm going to do the best that I can to try to explain this without leaving anyone behind or distilling some of the detail and the complexity of the passage. So like the first 23 verses they're very simple. It's very straightforward. And the ability to find practical application from these passages, which I do think is the most important thing we need to walk away with, is thinking, how can we take these things and appropriately apply them to our lives? That's very easy to do in the first 23 verses. It's just the last 4 verses that that kind of make it a little bit difficult. And we'll do the best we can with that. And we'll try to do it fairly and graciously. So let's begin by reading the passage. I'm reading out of the NASB, and I'm not, in the translation I'm giving here, I'm just copying and pasting the NASB. There'll be some parts that I think we can have a discussion on in regard to translation, but I'm going to wait until we start looking specifically at the passage for us to do that. So I'm just putting the NASB right here. Okay. Daniel chapter 9, starting in verse 1. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of Yahweh to Jeremiah the prophet, for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So I gave my attention to the Lord God to seek him by prayer and supplications while fasting, with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. I prayed to Yahweh my God and confessed and said, Alas, O Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant and loving kindness to those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned, committed iniquity, acted wickedly, and rebelled, even turning aside from your commandments and ordinances. Moreover, we have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name, to our kings, our princes, our fathers, and all the people of the land. Righteousness belongs to you, O Lord, but to us open shame, as it is this day. To the men of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and all Israel, to those who are nearby and those who are far away in all the countries to which you have driven them, because of their unfaithful deeds, which they have committed against you. Open shame belongs to us, O Lord, to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, because we have sinned against you. To the Lord our God belong compassion and forgiveness, for we have rebelled against him, nor have we obeyed the voice of Yahweh our God to walk in his teachings, which he set before us through his servants, the prophets. Indeed, all Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, not obeying your voice. So the curse has been poured out on us, along with the oath which is written in the law of Moses, the servant of God. for we have sinned against him. Thus he has confirmed his words, which he has spoken against us and against our rulers who ruled us, to bring on us great calamity. For under the whole heaven, there has not been done anything like what was done to Jerusalem. As it is written in the law of Moses, all this calamity will come upon us. Yet we have not sought the favor of Yahweh our God by turning from our iniquity and giving our attention to your truth. Therefore, Yahweh has kept the calamity in store and brought it on us. For Yahweh our God is righteous with respect to all his deeds which he has done, but we have not obeyed his voice. And now, O Yahweh our God, who have brought your people out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand, and have made a name for yourself, as it is this day, we have sinned. We have been wicked. O Lord, in accordance with your righteous acts, let now your anger and your wrath turn away from your city, Jerusalem, your holy mountain. For because of our sins and the iniquity of our fathers, Jerusalem and your people have become a reproach to all those around us. So now, O God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his supplications. And for your sake, O Lord, let your face shine on your desolate sanctuary. O my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations and the city, which is called by your name. For we are not presenting our supplications before you on account of any merits of our own, but on account of your great compassion. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and take action. For your own sake, O my God, do not delay, because your city and your people are called by your name. End quote. Now, while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of the people of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before Yahweh my God in behalf of the holy mountain of my God, while I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in a vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. He gave me instruction and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you insight with understanding. At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed, so give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision. And then he gives the vision, the final 4 verses. Let me get some water real quick. Okay. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with the flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. And then the chapter ends somewhat abruptly. All right. Well, I don't know about you, but it's hard to not be just in awe of the prayer that Daniel gave there. Like, to me, I think it's one of the most underappreciated prayers in the entire Bible. It seems to be one of the most penitent prayers in the entire Bible. And Daniel is kind of portrayed in the book of Daniel as one who is righteous. I mean, he's the good guy. He's the one that's obeying God. He's the one that's not compromising his faith. He's the one that's being the faithful Jew, and yet he's willing to acknowledge the sin of his people. I mean, he sees himself not as this sort of one faithful individual and everyone else is sinful. He understands that he is a part of the sinful people of God, and he wants to pray on their behalf. And I mean, my goodness, he doesn't try to make any sort of argument with God like, well, you need to do this because we're your people and you owe this to us. I mean, he acknowledges as honestly as he can the sin of the people, their rejection, their disobedience, and he knows that that good things are only going to happen in light of God's covenant commitment. So I think it's very, very powerful, and it shows, I think, the sort of belief that Jews had in the Second Temple period in regard to their relationship with God. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so we have to situate this passage in its context and in its timeline. That's the only way to make sense of why Daniel's even offering this particular prayer. There's a reason for it. It's not that Daniel's just a pious guy offering a prayer. So Daniel 9 takes place in the first year of Darius the Mede. And according to the chronology that the book of Daniel provides, this would actually place it in 536. Now, you have to connect to yourself that this is exactly 70 years after the exile as it's portrayed in the first two verses. So in the first two verses, it dates the exile to 606. So 606 minus 536 is 70 years, okay? So from the perspective of Daniel, he is writing this at a time when 70 years has already taken place. And what does he do? Daniel, he looks over the scrolls. I know it's translated as books, but they didn't have books back then. And the Hebrew noun sepharim effectively means scrolls. That's what they had. And so he's looking over the scrolls of Jeremiah. Why is it multiple scrolls? Because Jeremiah is too big to fit on one particular scroll. It would have obviously taken up multiple scrolls, okay? And so Daniel's reading Jeremiah. We've got an Old Testament figure reading another Old Testament figure. And this is one of the places where the Old Testament actually quotes the Old Testament. We're probably familiar with the New Testament quoting the Old Testament, but we don't have too many occurrences of the Old Testament quoting the Old Testament. This is one of them. Okay. And Daniel notes that Jeremiah speaks of a 70-year period that would result in the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem. And since 70 years has passed and Daniel and the Jews are still in captivity, they're still there under the rule of Darius the Mede, okay, this actually creates a problem, and it results in the long prayer that's offered by Daniel. Okay, so let me just make sure that we're clear on how this is working, okay? 70 years had taken place from the beginning of the chronology of Daniel in which the Jews are in exile. Daniel's reading Jeremiah, and he reads that the exile is going to last for 70 years. And then Daniel responds by praying, okay? So I think it's helpful for us to actually go and read the passage that Jeremiah that Jeremiah was talking about, that Daniel himself was reading, that led to him turning to prayer, okay? And this is the famous Jeremiah 29 passage. You're probably going to recognize Jeremiah 29:11, which is kind of one of these popular verses that's almost always ripped out of context and just kind of used as a general way of saying God has plans for us in some sort of vague way. But I think when you read it here in the context, you'll probably stop using that passage in that sort of lackadaisical way. So starting in verse 10, Jeremiah 29:10 says, for thus says Yahweh, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you and bring you back to this place. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares Yahweh, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me. That's the key thing. And I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart, and I will be found by you, declares Yahweh. And I will restore your fortunes and will gather you from all the nations and from all the places where I have driven you, declares Yahweh. And I will bring you back to the place from where I sent you into exile. And that's Jeremiah 29, verses 10 through 14. Okay. So what we're seeing here is that God says, you're going to have 70 years of exile. After that point, you're going to pray to me. you're going, and not just pray to me, you're going to seek me. You're going to call upon me. You're going to come. And it's this intense level of prayer. And God promises that he's going to listen to that prayer. Okay. And the whole point there is that you're going to search me with all of your heart. And this is actually drawing on language from Deuteronomy to where after the Shema is given, it says that you're to love the Lord your God with all of your heart. That's the sort of behavior that God desires. And Daniel chapter 9 is drawing on that sort of theology. But the promise is after the 70 years and after somebody prays, then God says, I'm going to restore all your fortunes. Okay. I'm going to restore your fortunes. I'm going to gather you and I'm going to bring you back into the land. Okay. So go back to the very first verse. 70 years had taken place. And Daniel's looking at this promise in Jeremiah. It's like, well, wait a minute. We have not had all of our fortunes restored. We have not been brought back into the promised land. You know, we don't have all the good things. Like we definitely don't have our temple again. You know, we don't have control of our land. So something's not right. Something's not quite adding up. Okay. That's the logic of what's taken place so far. And again, if you just read through and you don't understand what's happening, you don't understand the reason why Daniel is praying. And of course, you won't understand the revelatory vision that's given in the final 4 verses. Okay. So there's a sense to where there's a problem that needs to be addressed here. Okay. So again, since Jeremiah said that Israel will pray at the end of the 70-year punishment, Daniel obediently prays. Okay. So that's why he does it. He does it because he's reading Jeremiah and Jeremiah says that's what you're supposed to do. All right. All right. Now, his prayer can basically be summarized as follows. And really, we could just, if someone wanted to do an entire teaching just on this prayer, I think the community would really benefit from that because it's just very, very powerful. And I think it's in my top 3 prayers like of the entire Bible. It's so meaningful. It's so humble, and you can learn a lot about the sort of theology that God wants for his people. But basically, you can kind of sum it up into 4 points. Number 1, God is righteous. He keeps his covenant, and he has not mistreated Israel. Okay, so certainly bad things have happened to Israel, but Daniel doesn't say, well, where are you, God? Or why has this happened? Or like, help us explain this. Like, God is never accused of being malicious or mean. God's just keeping his covenant. Okay. And the covenant says, like, oh, if you obey, God's going to protect you and take care of you. But if you disobey, you're going to be punished. The curse is going to come upon you and you're going to be put into exile. Okay. So if God is righteous, that means he's faithful to his covenant. God's done his part. Unfortunately, Israel disobeyed their part. Israel disobeyed God, and Israel deserves all the punishment that has come upon them. Okay. Daniel doesn't mince words. He doesn't say, well, this is unfair, or this is mean, or this is too much, or this is unjust. He accepts all of it. He accepts all the blame. And he says, you know, we did all of this and this is what we deserve. Okay. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better response. Okay. We also see that if Israel keeps God's commandments and if they love him, and notice loving him is not this sort of heartfelt, like, I love God as if like God is my boyfriend. Love is the response that leads to obedience. Okay. So if Israel keeps the commandments and if they love him, they will remain in good standing within the covenant. Okay. Obviously, they're in exile and the curse has come upon them. They are not in good standing in the covenant, at least at the time of Daniel's prayer. And Israel's disobedience has led to reproach coming upon Jerusalem and the people. And it's interesting that sort of those 2 subjects there. We have kind of Jerusalem, the city, and the people. Jerusalem and the people. And of course, Jerusalem is the location of where the temple is. And so there's this focus on those 2 things that gets repeated throughout the prayer. And also they become the focal points of the 70 weeks prophecy at the end. So I want you to kind of keep those things in mind. We've got Jerusalem, namely the location of the sanctuary, and also the people of God. Okay. It's not just the people, it's also the location of Jerusalem wherein the temple is supposed to be. Okay. So there's the reproach that has come upon Jerusalem and the people, and it's not because of God, it's because of Israel's own disobedience. Okay. Okay. Now, Daniel's prayer also demonstrates that Jews in the Second Temple period did not believe in earning salvation by their own works of merit. So I again want to quote this passage just to really solidify this point. In 9:18, he says, "We are not presenting our supplication before you on account of any merits of our own, but on account of your great compassion." Okay, it's God's loving covenant commitment that would allow this forgiveness and restoration to take place. Okay, it's not that Daniel's saying, well, look at all the good works that we have, we can trade these in for some sort of credit and God is going to respond in some sort of way. Okay, doesn't mean that God isn't interested in good deeds. God certainly is. Okay, but the covenant relationship was based on God's gracious initiative and God's loving kindness. It wasn't based on Jews earning their salvation or earning anything with any sort of meritorious works. Okay, I have to keep pointing this out because there are too many people that read the New Testament and they read the things that Jesus says against the Jews or the things that Paul says against the Jews under this sort of assumption that Jews believed in earning salvation with merit. Clearly, that's not what was taking place. Okay, we don't have any evidence in the Second Temple period of any Jews believing that. Okay, that's an unfair caricature that was imposed upon the New Testament by misreadings by like Luther and some other people. Okay, so I really want to make sure that we hammer that particular point. Okay, so Gabriel, who by the way is the angelic revealer who helped Daniel understand the vision a few years earlier, he's actually mentioned in the previous vision of Daniel 8 verse 16. He shows up again to assist, and of course Daniel says, oh, by the way, this is Gabriel, the guy who showed up last time. So he's reminding you of that, right? And Gabriel's purpose is again to offer a heavenly revelatory insight, but this time he helps Daniel understand the meaning of the 70 years in Jeremiah 29. And here's a really important point that we need to make sure that we are absolutely clear on. What takes place is a reinterpretation, a brand new meaning on what the 70 years means. Okay, let me make sure that we're absolutely clear on this. Jeremiah 29 says 70 years of captivity will take place. Afterwards, there will be a prayer and the restoration of all the fortunes. Okay, of course, all those fortunes includes returning to the land, having control of the land, and having a good functioning temple. Okay, Daniel, after the 70 years, realized that hasn't taken place, not even close. He's still in captivity. They don't have control of their own land, and they certainly don't have a good functioning temple. Okay, so he prays, and Gabriel appears, and he gives a new interpretation of what Jeremiah 29 means. So Gabriel is not interpreting and telling us what Jeremiah 29 means. He is giving a reinterpretation. Okay, so that's important. Okay, we have Jeremiah 29, and we have Gabriel's reinterpretation of Jeremiah 29 to where he says it's not 70, it's 70 weeks or 77s. He's multiplying it by 7. Okay, that's really important before we move on to make sure that we are clear on that particular point. Okay, all right. So again, the prayer is pretty straightforward. I think a lot of people just kind of look at it and they say, okay, I get it. I see what's taking place. The questions involve the final 4 verses. Okay, so I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to look at the details of this particular point. Okay, so the passage has 4 verses, and the very first verse kind of introduces it, and then the final 3 verses kind of give all the details. Okay, so what does the 77s, and I'm saying sevens there in air quotes because it uses the word weeks, but the word for week is just the cardinal number 7. So it gets translated as 70 weeks, but it really is 77s. Okay, it's if you were learning how to count in Hebrew from 1 to 10, you would learn the number 7, and that's this particular word. Now it gets translated as a week, but you need to understand it's literally translated as just the number 7. Okay, all right. So what is this prophecy supposed to do? Well, the first verse, verse 24, gives 6 infinitives. Okay, well, I want to look at these infinitives. Okay, because unfortunately, the NASB has kind of rendered these in a particular way that I don't think is very, very helpful. So I'm going to suggest another reading, and I'm going to try to give you an argument as to why a new reading is more likely. Okay. The first thing is that it's supposed to finish transgression. Okay. What is transgression? Well, the Hebrew phrase means a cultic law violation. There's some sort of violation that's taking place with the cultic um, temple procedures. Okay. So what does it mean to finish transgression? I think, well, to put an end to the desecrating violations of the temple in Jerusalem. Okay. So this is not a general sense that, oh, there are transgressions and sins and falling short of God's favor. It's something more specific. Okay. There are cultic, spoiling, desolating violations that are taking place involving the temple. And this, the vision is going to put an end to that. It's going to finish those things. Number two, to seal sins. Okay. Now here, if you have in your printed Bible, and I can attest this, in my NASB, it will actually have a footnote for this, and it'll say that another reading is to seal up sins, to seal sins. Okay. But the one that's actually in the text says to make an end of the sin. Okay. Now, the text does not tell you why there are multiple readings of this. So let me clarify why that is. Okay. In the Hebrew text, sometimes we have two readings. We have the original reading, which is called the Ketiv. Ketiv is just the Hebrew phrase, which means that which is written. Okay. And we have the Kore, which is an interpretation of what you're supposed to say after you read the Ketiv. Okay. So we have the Kore and the Ketiv. Again, Ketiv is what is said, or what is written. And the Kore is what you're supposed to say. Okay. So the Kore is kind of like someone came in after and put into the Hebrew text a note as to how you're supposed to read and interpret this. Okay. But the original Ketiv, what was actually originally written, says to seal sins. And the interpretation, the Kore, that was written sometime later, says to make an end of the sin, with a definite article and a singular sin. Okay. Now, you're probably familiar with the most common Kore Ketiv in the Old Testament, which is kind of what I've been doing there, where we take the name of God. Okay. The name of God, obviously, when you read in Hebrew, it says Yahweh. But for the pious Jews, even though it says Ketiv Yahweh, they actually don't say that. They actually think, okay, well, the tradition afterwards is you don't read the name of God. You say Adonai, or you say Hashem. Okay. But that is an interpretation that came later. Okay. But the original text says Yahweh. So here, the original text says to seal sins. Okay. That's important. Okay. So to me, it's like, I, of course, am going to recognize that there's an original reading. There's a reading that came after it as an interpretation. And I'm noticing that there are some changes from the first to the second. Okay. So to seal sins. Okay. And this is actually a sealing of, like, you're putting a lid on something. You're actually containing, or you're keeping sins in check. Okay. Which, by the way, is something that the regular sacrifices in the temple, the morning and the evening sacrifices, that's what they were supposed to do. That was their function. That was their intention. You would have the regular sacrifices, and that's how you keep sin at bay. All right. But there's a big difference between sealing, as in containing or keeping in check sins in general, to making an end to the sin. We've now moved it down to a singular sin, and we're saying we're going to put a stop to sin altogether. Okay. Now, here's the thing. We don't know exactly when that interpretive part was actually put into the text. We don't know when that actually was. Okay. But it wasn't original to the writing of Daniel. The original Hebrew said to seal sins. Okay. So I'm going to go with the original, and I'm naturally skeptical of anyone coming in and changing the original meaning to say something else. But I want you to be aware of the dynamics of that. Okay. The third infinitive says to cover iniquity. Okay. In other words, to cover the sinful behavior, by the way, that was mentioned in Daniel's prayer when he uses the same Hebrew noun avon. Okay. So this word for iniquity was used earlier in the prayer in verses 13 and 16. Okay. So if Daniel is offering this prayer and Gabriel shows up and he says, hey, I'm going to give you this prophecy that's to cover iniquity, it seems that Gabriel is answering the prayer by answering specifically the things that Daniel is praying about. Okay. So he's not just saying just kind of vague or generalized iniquity. It seems that he's answering the specific sort of iniquity that Daniel has been mentioning, because Gabriel uses the same Hebrew noun that Daniel had used multiple times in his own prayer. Number 4, to bring in everlasting righteousness. So what is everlasting? Well, just perpetual. And what is righteousness? It's covenant faithfulness. Okay. Which again was the regular sacrifices were meant to ensure. Okay. But from the perspective of Daniel, who is in exile, and there is no temple and there are no sacrifices taking place, that would mean that all of the sins that are taking place during that time, they're not being covered, they're not being forgiven. And so, there's something that they're looking forward to that's going to actually bring in this sort of perpetual covenant faithfulness. And again, the sacrifices would ensure that, but they're obviously not taking place, during the majority of Daniel's lifetime. The 5th infinitive is to seal up vision and prophecy. And this is another unfortunate, I don't know why they did this, because the word in Hebrew means prophet. It's the word for the prophet, as in the person who actually goes and speaks forth something. It's not the thing that's said, it's the person that is speaking. And I think my footnote says literally prophet. I don't know why you would, why don't they just put prophet there? I don't understand that. But again, what prophet is being described here? Well, in the context, the prophet is the prophet Jeremiah, and of course his own vision that was resulting in the 70-year exile and the promise of restoration. Okay. So if Daniel is praying about the conclusion of the prophet's vision, then of course the answer that Gabriel gives in response to that prayer is going to seal this up. It's going to bring it to its completion. Okay. And lastly, it says to anoint the most holy place. Again, I don't know why they don't translate this literally. Literally in Hebrew, it's the Holy of Holies. Okay. So, I mean, you might read the most holy place and you might have some that might be open to interpretation, but the Holy of Holies, we know exactly what that is. That's the inner room inside the temple. Okay. But what does it mean to anoint the most holy place? I mean, the Holy of Holies. It means to authorize the temple for its most crucial purposes in a sort of rededication ceremony. Okay. You're anointing it, as in you're sanctioning it and you're authorizing it to do what it's supposed to do. Okay. You're cutting the ribbon and you're saying, okay, now is the time to do this. All right. So the prophecy of the 70 weeks is supposed to accomplish these 6 things: to finish transgression, to seal sins, to cover iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and the prophet, and to anoint the Holy of Holies. Okay. So we have to kind of keep those things in mind. But I want you to notice that there has already been attempts to kind of, I don't want to say obscure it, but to kind of, put a spin on these to kind of say something a little bit different than what they originally say in the Hebrew. Okay. And luckily, at least my translation tries to give some footnotes to try to at least be honest about that. But if you have a Bible that doesn't have footnotes, you're at a loss. Okay. So that's the opening verse, verse 24. Okay. Verse 25. I'm going to keep the text up there at the top and we're going to talk about this. Okay. So what's going on here? He says, you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And then some sort of generic, vague description of being rebuilt, a plaza and a moat, and vague times of distress. Okay. So here's something we got to keep in mind. We've got 70 weeks, which is literally 77s. Okay. And so we can see the period is kind of split up into 3 different sections. Very important that you see these 3 sections. Okay. We've got 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and the final 2 verses deal with the final week. So 7 plus 62 plus 1 equals 70. All right. Okay. So we got that. Again, we're trying to figure out, like, what is the purpose of all these things? Why do we have that? Okay. All right. Now, the word weeks is literally the cardinal number 7. Okay. So I'm going to continue to use weeks or 7s there, but it's, don't think of it as like a week, as in like a period of 7 days. You need to think of it as like the number 7. 70 times 7. 70 times 7. Okay. And so if you are familiar, by the way, with the book of Revelation, you're already starting to see some of these numbers that we've become familiar with, because we know that numbers in apocalyptic literature have more to do with the function of those numbers than the arithmetical meaning of the numbers. Now, understand this of what Gabriel is actually doing. Jeremiah's 70-year period is now multiplied by 7. He says it's not about 70 years that Jeremiah talked about. It's now 70 times 7. 70 sevens have been decreed for the people in the holy city, which again, of course, is what Daniel is praying about. He's praying about the city and the holy people. This is where, again, this is a reinterpretation of Jeremiah 29. Jeremiah 29 was about 70 years. Gabriel says, okay, something new is going to take place here. We've got 70 times 7. And I hope everyone is still following along with me. Okay. All right. Now, 7 is the apocalyptic number of completion. And we've seen this throughout the book of Revelation. Okay. 7 is the number of completion. Okay. We have 7 days in a week. Okay. So it's just 7 is that number of completion. Okay. And this to me strongly suggests that 70 weeks is not meant to be multiplied out literally into 490 years. Okay. So I think the first problem when people take this and they start setting up a timeline is that they start to read apocalyptic numbers literally, and they start to try to fit them into history. Okay. I don't think that's what the original meaning of this was. Okay. And as we've seen in the book of Revelation, clearly that's not how the apocalyptic minded people of God were understanding the function of numbers, where the number 7 shows up many, many, many times. And almost every time it is a number that has a meaning of completion rather than 1 more than 6 and 1 less than 8. Now, we have a little bit of confirmation of this with a statement that Jesus said. Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I don't say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. Okay, so let me ask you, do you think Jesus wants you to tally up the number of times you forgive your brother, and once you get to 490, you stop forgiving him at that particular point? No, I don't think that's what he means. I think Jesus is using these numbers involving completion, and he's saying that, look, you just need to have this open willingness to just continually forgive him. Okay. So my suggestion is that if we know that in apocalyptic literature, 7 is a number of completion and is not generally used as a specific number, and if Jesus himself describes 70 times 7 to refer to just an unending period of forgiveness, then it seems unlikely that these authors meant for us to interpret 7 as a literal chronological number that we should multiply by 70 and come up with 490 years. Okay. So what I'm telling you is that a lot of people will take 490 years and they'll use it in these sort of end times, let's figure out the date of the return of Jesus sort of idea. But I think that's misreading the function of numbers in apocalyptic literature and the way that Jesus himself used it. Here's another thing to kind of consider. Notice that Israel was put into exile. They didn't have control of their land, and they didn't have a functioning temple as a punishment for their sins. So when they get out of exile and they're in their land and they actually have a temple, you would say that they've been forgiven. Wouldn't you agree? Okay, if they're punished for their sins and they're in this theological timeout, after they come back in the land and they have everything, then they're forgiven. That's clear. Okay. I mean, it doesn't do any good to forgive someone who's in jail, but you leave them in jail. The point is, if they come out of jail, then the sense that, they've kind of been forgiven of that, of their transgression. Here's another thing to kind of consider with that number. We got 70 times 7 and 490. Okay. 49 is also the number describing Jubilee. In the Hebrew Bible, after 49 years, there is supposed to be this sense of forgiveness to where debts are forgiven. And so what is 490? Well, you have 10 Jubilees. Okay. So there's a sense to which 70 times 7 involves a sense of forgiveness. There's a sense to where 490 is 10 jubilees, also involving forgiveness. And Jesus himself also seeing 70 times 7 on the topic of forgiveness, where he continues with the parable of God's forgiveness of people and how we should also be forgiving because God is very forgiving. Okay. So again, we're thinking here, what is the purpose and the function of these numbers? It's to bring about forgiveness to the people and the sanctuary, rather than taking it and let's kind of like multiply these things out. Okay, so again, I'm just trying to make the case there of how the numbers function. And if we just forget all that, then we can try to plug all these things and try to figure out when Jesus is going to come back. And, and guess what? Every single person that's made a suggestion about that has been wrong. All of them. Every person who's made a projection on that has been wrong. Okay. Now, there's another important thing that there's no way you can see this in your English translation. You actually have to go back and read the Hebrew. In the Hebrew text, there is a marker called an atna, which is a Hebrew break or a pause that separates the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks. And that's important. Okay. So when you're reading it, it says, from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks pause, and there will be 62 weeks. Okay. Now, if you don't know, if you can't read Hebrew, you're just going to read 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and you're going to wonder, okay, why are those two things separated? Why do we do that? Well, let's just kind of add them together, and let's just turn that into 69 weeks. Okay. And that's what many people do. But first of all, if the text meant for you to do that, why wouldn't they just say 69 weeks? Why would they go out of their way to say 7 weeks and 62 weeks? And then in the next verse, it'll say after the 62-week period. If it meant 69 weeks, it would have said that. But not only does it not say that, and it differentiates the two and uses weeks with 7 and weeks with 62. But in the Hebrew, there is a deliberate marker there that's meant to force the reader to have a deliberate pause. It's as if the writer wanted you to make this connection of saying, okay, 7 weeks, pause, break, and then there's going to be a 62. They were not meant to be put together and added together into 69. Okay. So again, it's one of those things that you can't see in your English translation. But what they should have done is they should have put like a comma or a semicolon to kind of break it up there, but it's there in the Hebrew. And if you can't read Hebrew, you would never know that. Okay. All right. So what is this passage saying? From the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until an anointed prince / leader, there's going to be 7 weeks. Now, why in the world did I do that? Well, the word Mashiach, okay, does not have the definite article in Hebrew. This is not the anointed one that we might all think about as the Messiah. This is just an anointed prince or an anointed leader. Okay. And guess what? In the Old Testament, the king is not the only person that's described as the Mashiach. Priests are also called the Mashiach because they are anointed for a particular purpose. And I gave you some examples there throughout the book of Leviticus, which of course is all about maintaining the holiness of the people of God. Okay. So here, I want you to notice that your translator, by translating it as Messiah the Prince, has already interpreted an anointed person as a very particular anointed person. Okay. But you got to make an argument for that. Okay. And to me, I'm not quite sure I want to jump and to make that particular jump there. Okay. So we actually do know about an anointed figure who functioned as a leader not long after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And his name was Joshua the high priest. And he's mentioned quite heavily in the first 2 chapters of Haggai and in Zechariah chapter 3. He was also very famous because he was the very first high priest to function as the priest of the second Jerusalem temple. Okay. So the point is, we can sit there and we can see that, okay, if we're taking these three different time periods, we've got a 7-year time period, we've got a 7-week time period, a 62-week, and then a small 1 week. It says, from the issuing of the decree to, rebuild Jerusalem until this anointed figure who's going to be a ruler, there's going to be 7 weeks. Okay, so it's kind of like out of this whole figure of 49, there's a short period, and we're going to have, an anointed person. Okay, the point is, it's not the anointed one. If it meant to be the anointed one, it would use a definite article, but it's not. It's not there in the Hebrew. Okay, so we have a person from history that we know seems to fulfill this, and we have mention of this person in multiple books, and highlighting his significance as someone who was involved in ushering in and trying to rebuild and to fix the functions of the temple. We know who that person is. Okay, that's not so important, because as the passage is going to go on, we're going to see that things change. Okay, so again, I'm pointing out to you that again, the translator's already made a decision for you, and you need to be aware that decision has been made, and you decide if you think that decision is actually legitimate or not. Okay, now the second period of time, the 62 weeks, seems to skip over lots of history. It's not noting, it's only noting in passing these sort of like vague and unspecific indications of, okay, Jerusalem's built, it's going to have a plaza, it's going to have a moat, and then it's described with some sort of generic references to times of distress. Okay, but it gets much, much clearer, and the details become much more specific once we move to the 70th week. Okay, and we should not be surprised at this. We should not be surprised at these visions in Daniel seemingly skipping over a large period of time and then focusing specifically on one final kingdom. In fact, giving most of its attention to one final kingdom. So we saw this in Daniel chapter 2, where we had the vision of the statue and the interpretation of the statue, spent almost all of its focus, all of its emphasis on the final kingdom. Same thing in Daniel chapter 7. We have 4 beasts and 4 kingdoms, but the interpretation focused almost entirely on the last kingdom. Same thing in Daniel chapter 8, okay, where we have the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks, but it skips over the Medes and Persians very quickly, so it can spend almost all of its time on the Greeks. And so in these 4 verses, we have verse 24, which introduces the vision. Verse 25 talks about 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And then you have the final 2 verses focusing on the last week. What's actually taking place here is that the majority of the passage is focusing on the 7th week, 66% of the passage, to where the first 69 weeks get only 1 verse. This is the point that I'm trying to make here, is that it's not looking to detail all of these things with equal measure. It's not wanting you to focus on all of these things with the same amount of attention. It's trying to quickly move over so it can focus on the final part, where it wants to zoom in and give most of its time, most of the verses, most of the attention, and most of the specific details. Okay, so I understand that 62 is a big period, but you can see it just skips over it, just kind of with these vague references. Yeah, it's going to be rebuilt. Yeah, there's going to be vague times of distress, but the details get much clearer once we get to the 70th week, where it dedicates 2/3 of the passage to describing. Okay, so again, we shouldn't be surprised at this, because this is the way that Daniel has been using the visions throughout the entire book. And I put up a chart every single time to really make this point. Okay, now let's look at verse 26. Okay, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. Interesting. Okay, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with the flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. Okay. All right. So what's going on here? At the end of this vague 62-week period, we have an anointed one, no definite article. He's going to be cut off and he's going to have nothing. Okay. Now, let me tell you, there are a lot of people that said, boom, look right there. That is a prophecy of Jesus. And I would love for that to be true, but I don't think it is. I'm going to say this again. I would love for this to be a prophecy of the death of the Messiah, but I don't think that's what the passage is talking about. Okay. Guess what? It's not quoted or alluded to anywhere in the New Testament. And we know the New Testament writers, especially the early Christians, who are trying to convince other Jews of the legitimacy of Jesus being the Jewish Messiah. They were scouring the Old Testament. They were looking for all of these passages in order to prove that the Messiah had to suffer and die. And you know what they would do? They would quote Isaiah 53. They would allude to Hosea chapter 6. They would describe Jesus as the Passover lamb, but never once do they quote Daniel chapter 9. Never once, because that's not how they understood this passage. They didn't understand it that way. Furthermore, look at what's being said here. The Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, which literally in Hebrew is the anointed one will be cut off and no one will come to his aid. Is that what we actually think of Jesus? Was he killed and no one came to his aid? No, that's not what we think at all. In fact, the point is not that Jesus died, but that God, the Father, did come to his aid and actually raised him from the dead. So how in the world could this be a prophecy of the death of Jesus? It's saying that he's going to die and no one's going to come and help him. The whole point of the Christian faith is that God, in fact, did come and vindicate and rescue Jesus. So we have the logical argument that this doesn't seem to fit the Messiah. We have the evidence of the New Testament, where the New Testament writers never once quote this passage when we know that it would be in their best interest to do so, indicating that's not how they read this. And what I'm going to argue is that we have the historical argument, and by placing this in its context, we know exactly who it refers to. We know exactly who the anointed high priest who was cut off and no one coming to his aid was. We know who that actual person is. His name was Onias III, and he was a high priest, okay? And he was murdered in the year 171 BC. And as he was being murdered, no Jews came to help him. No one tried to avenge his death afterwards. And this is kind of crazy because in that particular period when the Jews didn't have a king, the most important person, the leader of the people would be the high priest. And so you've got like their leader being murdered and nobody going to help him, no one going to protect him, no one going to vindicate him. It's a little weird. Okay, so the point is we have a better suggestion in history in the time period that actually fits the description of this. And again, the Hebrew does not say the anointed one. It says an anointed one will be cut off. Okay. And the point is obviously that since this happens after the 62-week period, this is not the same anointed figure that was mentioned earlier prior to the 62-week period. I think that should be pretty obvious. Okay. All right. Now, what's interesting is that the high priest Onias III's evil brother, whose name was Jason, a good Greek name, by the way, he was a Hellenistic sympathizer. He took over the temple with the blessing of the Greek ruler Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who we've already seen in the book of Daniel is this little horn figure that harasses and persecutes the people of God. We saw that in Daniel chapter 7, and we saw it in Daniel chapter 8, and it's going to be clear that he shows up here in Daniel chapter 9. Okay. So then the passage goes on, and it says, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay, so the people, that is the Greek people, of the prince who is to come, that is Antiochus IV. So the verb doesn't mean to destroy. It means to kind of corrupt or to spoil, okay? So they're going to corrupt and they're going to spoil the city, that's Jerusalem, and the sanctuary, that's the temple. Guess what? We know from history that's exactly what happened. We've already seen that in our teachings on Daniel chapter 7. We've already seen it in our teachings in Daniel chapter 8. We've seen it looking at the history in the book of Maccabees. We've already seen that Antiochus IV was the Greek king that came during this time period, and he spoiled and corrupted Jerusalem by trying to make it a Greek city-state. And of course, he set up the image of Zeus Olympus on the altar in the temple. And of course, that would be very, very sacrilegious and abhorrent to all Jews. Now, here's another part where, unfortunately, we have an issue with Hebrew translating. So we have the last sentence there where it says, its end will come with a flood. You see right there? Its end. Okay. Well, what does the its end refer to? Okay. Well, the nearest antecedent is the word sanctuary. We have and the antecedents that come before that, we have sanctuary, and then moving across, we have city, and then we have the prince. Okay. But the nearest one is the sanctuary. Okay. But here's the thing. The word, the suffix, the pronominal suffix on end is masculine. And so that suffix has to match with a masculine word. And if you don't know Hebrew, you can't see this. But the words sanctuary and city are both feminine. So the nearest antecedent that is masculine is actually the prince. And so I actually think it's much more accurate to translate it as his end will come with the flood. Let me make sure that we're clear on that. Okay. So the word it's, that sounds like it's kind of like neutral, but in Hebrew, the suffix could either be masculine or feminine. And that suffix has to match the grammatical gender of the noun to which it is referring. Okay. So if the end belongs to a him, a masculine subject, or it can't refer to the sanctuary, which is grammatically feminine. It can't refer to the city, which is also grammatically feminine. So the closest thing is the prince. In other words, this is not saying that the sanctuary's end will come with the flood. It's saying the prince's end will come with the flood. His end will come with the flood. And again, I have to apologize, because it's like if you don't have any Hebrew knowledge, then you're stuck with whatever the translation has told you. And I've tried to point out here, there's a half dozen places to where they're not quite being honest, and they want the translation to say something based on a particular theology that I don't think the Hebrew will allow. Okay. All right. So the people and the prince, they're going to come and do something bad. They're going to spoil the city and the sanctuary, but his end is going to come with the flood, and there are going to be desolations that are determined. Okay. Hopefully you're able to follow that. Last verse. Okay. This one's not as complicated. Okay. And he will make a firm covenant. Who is he? Well, he, of course, is this desolating ruler, Antiochus IV. Okay. He's going to make a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, in the midst of that week, he's going to put a stop to sacrifice and grain offerings. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. There's that abomination desolation language that we saw in chapter 8. Even until a complete destruction, one that's decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Who is the one who's making desolate? That's the prince. That's Antiochus IV. So we could see that there has already been a decree that he's going to come to an end. God's already decreed he's going to die. Okay. So this is what's going to happen in that final week. Okay. Notice like all the attention is here on the final week. What's going to happen? Antiochus makes a covenant with the Jews around the time of the death of the high priest Onias III, the death of the high priest Onias III, and of course the installation of Jason. All right. In the middle of this week, the temple sacrifices are stopped, and the abomination of desolation is set up in the temple. Okay. We know that from history. All right. These terrible tragedies will last until a complete destruction is poured out on the one who desolates. Okay. Who's the one who's desolating? That's Antiochus. Okay. And we can see here, the point is that it's already been decreed, meaning God has already said it's going to happen. He's opened the books and he said, judgment's going to happen. It's going to take place. God's not abandoned his people during these terrible tragedies. He's already said judgment day is going to come for this particular guy. He's going to get what's coming to him. Now, here's something that I find really, really interesting. This whole thing lasts over one particular week. For what it's worth, Onias III was murdered in 171 BC. And by the way, at the end of all this, the temple was rededicated, thereby resuming the regular sacrifices in 164. If you take out your calculator, guess what? 171 minus 164 seems to be 7, which seems to fit the final week. Okay. Now, I know you've kind of heard me say, well, we shouldn't read these numbers literally. And I think generally that's true. But I also think that this seems to be a little too convenient to be, a coincidence. Okay. I think the readers reading this would say like, yeah, we know these events. We know these things happen. Boom, that right there. And that indicates that, yeah, God did fulfill his promises. I think that's kind of interesting and fascinating. Okay. My point is that we can fit everything that's being said here into history. And if you just ignore this history, then you try to throw this into the future because you just don't really know what to do with it. Okay. So let's kind of go back and just kind of, again, look at those, the initial introduction to the 70 weeks. We have these 6 infinitives. Okay. Because there are a lot of Christians that, they want this to refer to Jesus in some sort of way. So some people will say, well, this whole thing, it deals with the death of Jesus, or it deals with the destruction of the temple, or it deals with the end of the age of the return of Jesus. Okay, well, Gabriel told us that this particular vision, which is multiplying out the purpose of Jeremiah's vision of the 70 years times 7, is going to have 6 functions. Okay, so to fulfill transgression, okay, which is to put an end to the desecrating violations of the temple in Jerusalem, okay, did the end of this period, which I'm suggesting ends in 164, when the temple is rededicated, did that put an end to the desecrating violations in the temple that Antiochus put in? Absolutely. Yep, that's true. So that fits. Okay. Did that fit any of the events involving Jesus? No, it doesn't. It doesn't fit, or at least it doesn't fit very clearly. To seal sins, namely to contain or to keep sins in check, because the regular sacrifices are doing what they're supposed to do. Well, that, of course, is taking place whenever the temple is rededicated in 164, because the temple is now functioning. Okay. Is it going to cover iniquity? Okay. As in deal with the sinful behavior that Daniel's prayer was praying about, you know, the sinful behavior of the Jewish people that led to them being exiled, losing their land, and losing their temple. Well, of course, when the temple is rededicated, then they not only have come back to their land, they have control of their land, and they have control of their temple. So that fits as well. Okay. It answers the thing that Daniel was praying about. Okay. Does it bring in perpetual covenant faithfulness because regular sacrifices are taking place? And of course, they weren't happening at the time of Daniel's prayer. Yes, that's true, because the temple was rededicated and it was now functioning as it should for the first time in 400 years. Okay. Is it sealing up the vision and the prophet, namely sealing up the vision that the prophet Jeremiah had described? Well, yes, because the prophet that Jeremiah described was saying there'll be a 70-year period, and then God is going to restore all the fortunes. In 164, all those fortunes were restored. They were back in the land. They were no longer in exile. They had control of their land for the first time in 400 years, and they had a functioning temple. Yes, that works. And did they anoint the Holy of Holies? Yes, that's exactly what happened when they rededicated the temple. They anointed the Holy of Holies to function as it should. I don't know how that fits with the death of Jesus or anything else. It doesn't work that way. So again, I just think that all of these fit into that particular time period. It fits the description of all the other visions in the book of Daniel that we've looked at. It's not something brand new. It's the same thing. It's the same topic. All right. Now, how would the initial readers have understood everything that's going on here? Okay, because I think that helps us. Okay, so what do we know from the first historical writings that were interpreting Daniel and the events that took place? So in 2 Maccabees chapter 4, we learned that a guy named Menelaus, thinking he had obtained a suitable opportunity, stole some of the gold vessels of the temple. That's bad. And he gave them to Andronicus, other vessels. As it happened, he had sold to Tyre and to the neighboring the neighboring cities. When Onias, that's Onias III, who was the high priest, when he became fully aware of these acts, he publicly exposed them, having first withdrawn to a place of sanctuary at Daphne near Antioch. Therefore, Menelaus, taking Andronicus aside, urged him to kill Onias. Andronicus came to Onias and, resorting to treachery, offered him sworn pledges and gave him the right hand. He persuaded him, though still suspicious, to come out from the place of sanctuary. Then, with no regard for justice, he immediately got rid of him. What does it mean to get rid of him? It means that he killed him. We know that happened in history. We know the high priest, the anointed one, was killed abruptly and nobody came to his aid and nobody helped him. We know that happened. Of course, we've already read in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 11, that in those days certain renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, "Come, let us make a covenant with the Gentiles around us." We learn in Daniel 9:27 that they make a covenant during the final week. We know that happened in history. It's the first thing that's said in the first 11 verses of 1 Maccabees. Okay. And then we see later in that chapter that on the 15th day of Kislev, that they erected the abomination of desolation on the altar burnt offerings. And the interesting thing is that the writer, 1 Maccabees, grabs the Greek term from the Septuagint of Daniel and reproduces it here. He's quoting from Daniel to say this is what took place. Okay. And so you can't see this in your English, but the writer quotes the same Greek that's used in the Septuagint of Daniel to connect these events. Okay. My point is that the initial readers knew all of these things affected the time of the Maccabean revolt and the events surrounding Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. Okay. That's nice and dandy and fine and a good history lesson, but how does this apply to us today? How does this apply to us readers as Christians today? Okay. Now, if I believed that this involved future prophecy, what I would tell you is you need to go grab your calendars and let's start counting days and counting years, and we can figure out exactly when Jesus is going to come back. I think that's the wrong use of Scripture. Okay. Jesus himself said, nobody knows the day or the hour. I don't know it, he doesn't know it, and you don't know it. So what is the right way to interpret this passage? Well, I do want to focus on Daniel's prayer, which is the majority of this passage. And Daniel's prayer is an excellent example of showing honesty in matters of communication with God. And Daniel's example encourages us to continually exhibit humility and honesty with God, trusting in his covenant faithfulness. I mean, the words that Daniel gives and just the transparency that he has, not just for himself, but for all the people, demonstrates that he's honest. He's honest about the sin. He's honest about the transgressions. And he comes humbly before God, okay? And he's not trusting in his own deeds. He's trusting in God and God's love and God's covenant and God's faithfulness to that covenant. And so it's hard to not walk away and to say, hey, we need to imitate Daniel's prayer and his attitude given directly in that prayer. Number two, although Daniel is portrayed as a righteous and devout Jew, he understands that he is not a loner, but rather he is a member of the wider people of God. And in a similar manner, we should be mindful of others when we pray. Guess what? Just as Jesus taught. Consider the Lord's Prayer. Notice that when we pray in the Lord's Prayer, we're not just praying about us, we're praying about others. Jesus said, give us this day our daily bread, not give me this day my daily bread. He says, forgive us our trespasses, not forgive me my trespasses. Lead us not into temptation, not lead me, not in temptation. Deliver us from the evil one, not deliver me. Notice that Jesus himself also is saying that when you pray, pray on behalf of the community because you're a member of the community. Stop thinking of yourself as this lone ranger, this one person that's off by themselves. You're part of the body of Christ. You need to act like it. You need to pray like it. This is what Jesus taught us to do. And this follows in the footsteps of Daniel and his magnificent prayer. Number three, the prophetic words offered by Gabriel sought to encourage those suffering persecution at the hands of Antiochus by saying that the God of heaven is in control and has already decreed the defeat of this evildoer. You know what? In our culture, there's a lot of violence and uncertainty going on. So I think the applicable thing we should do is that by recognizing that violence, persecution are increasing in our world, we need to take advantage of these opportunities to share the hope of the return of Christ, because the return of Christ will bring an end to evil on this earth. Just as Gabriel offered hope and comfort to those who were suffering persecution and violence, and if they were reading it at that time, they were in the midst of it. They were in the midst of everything that was going on. The passage offered them hope that God had set a day in which judgment was going to take place. Okay. And of course, readers year after knew that, yes, Antiochus was no more. And the Jews actually had control of their land and they had control of their temple. Okay. So we too can offer hope to people in the midst of these uneasy times by sharing them the real hope. Jesus is going to come back. He's going to inaugurate the kingdom. He's going to rule from Jerusalem on the throne of David, and he's going to put an end to evil. He's going to judge the world, and he's going to vindicate the righteous, and we're going to reign and rule with him. And that's the hope. That the hope is not electing more leaders or passing more laws or outlawing more people or kicking more people out of a nation. The hope is the return of Jesus. The hope is the kingdom of God. And that's what we need to share with people. And lastly, when the question of forgiveness was raised to Jesus, he responded by teaching his disciples that we must not just forgive 7 times, but 70 times 7. And so Jesus calls his disciples to be quick to forgive those who repent, just as God is quick to forgive us. And I already alluded to this. We say, God, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. There's a connection between God being quick to forgive us. We need to be quick to forgive other people. Jesus said that as well. And of course, he does it by using this figure of 70 times 7, which I don't think is meant to be multiplied out into exactly 490. All right, there we go. It's a lot of stuff to kind of keep on the plates. I think we're kind of running a little bit on the long side right now. I'll probably cut the video and make sure that we have some time here for some questions. If you're watching this, appreciate you watching. Thank you so much. Hopefully you've found some sort of sense of navigating this complex passage, but hopefully you found some benefit in the prayer life of Daniel. If you want to get in contact with us or have fellowship with us, check out the information in the description of the video below, and we'd love to have you. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.